Okay. Last time we developed a number of principles that seem to govern how it is that we remember events in the past and why it is we tend to forget them. These principles can be organized in terms of this stage analysis of memory that divides the processing of memories into three different stages: encoding, storage, and retrieval. And we discussed a number of principles that seem to operate at these various stages. The elaboration principle that says that memory is good when you relate an event to something you already know. The organization principle says that memory is good when you relate individual events to each other. The time dependency principle says that memories tend to fade with time, and we know that at least as far as long-term memory is concerned, that what's responsible for this time dependency is a kind of competition that creates interference among memories available in storage. When we come to the retrieval phase of memory processing, we discussed the distinction between the availability of a trace in memory and the accessibility of a trace at any particular retrieval attempt. And we saw two principles that seem to govern the accessibility of memories. The Q dependency principle, which says that memory is good when the cues used to retrieve a memory are rich and informative, highly informative. And finally, the encoding specificity principle, which basically says memory is best when the cues processed at the time of retrieval match the cues that were processed at the time of encoding. There's one more principle of memory that I want to talk about right now, and it's one that relates two forms of declarative memory. Episodic memory, which we've been talking about all this time, memory for particular events, and semantic memory, which is our knowledge about the world, our mental dictionary or mental encyclopedia. And the question is, what's the relationship between our knowledge about the world in general and our memory for specific events that we've experienced? This is a problem that has been studied in a variant on the verbal learning paradigm known as the person memory paradigm, in which what people are doing is encoding and storing and retrieving memories about particular individual people. So what happens in this kind of study is that the subjects in the experiment will study a set of list items that aren't isolated words, but rather are sentences that describe the experiences and the behaviors that are attributable to some person, okay? So rather than seeing words and pictures, you're studying sentences that describe various kinds of behaviors. And in addition to studying this kind of material, you're also given some generic knowledge about the person in question. So, for example, I might tell you that there's this person I know, her name is Judy, and she is intelligent and sophisticated and artistic and refined and imaginative and witty. You got a good image of what this person is like now? Okay, fine. That's your knowledge about this person in general. And now here are some things that she did and some experiences she had. What I'm trying to do by describing her to you as intelligent and sophisticated is to induce a kind of schema, an organized representation of what this person is like in general, creating you a set of knowledge and beliefs and expectations about what this person is like. And now, having done that, let's look at some behaviors that Judy engaged in. Some of the behaviors on the list are what we call schema-congruent behaviors. That is, they're the kinds of behaviors that we'd expect to observe in the person just described. So, having described Judy as intelligent and sophisticated and artistic, it should be no surprise, no particular surprise, that she won a chess tournament or that she attended a symphony concert. Other behaviors in the list, however, are schema incongruent in that they are surprising or unexpected kinds of events given what you know about this person in general. So, for example, I tell you that Judy made the same mistake 3 times. That's not exactly what you'd expect of a highly intelligent person. Or I say to you, Judy was confused by the daytime television show. And again, that's not necessarily what you'd expect to observe in a highly intelligent person. And then there's a set of behaviors that are simply schema irrelevant. They don't have anything to do with what I told you about Judy in general, such as Judy ordered a sandwich for lunch, or Judy took the elevator to the 3rd floor. You can be smart, you can be stupid, you can order a sandwich for lunch. You can be sophisticated, you can be unsophisticated, you can take an elevator to the 3rd floor. These kinds of facts don't have anything to do with your impression of Judy. So what happens in these experiments is, first subjects study some general information about a person, intended to induce a schema, and then they study a list of events that vary in their relatedness to the schema. Some events schema congruent, some events schema incongruent, some events schema irrelevant, and then we test people's memory. And when we test people's memory, we get a very interesting pattern of results, which is that schema irrelevant events tend to be relatively poorly remembered. In this particular experiment, only about 38% of the schema irrelevant events were remembered by the subjects, whereas schema congruent events are remembered a little bit better. This is about 44%. That's a significant difference for those who want to know. So that there's a significant improvement in memory for schema congruent events over schema irrelevant events. But the really interesting part of this study is that schema incongruent events are remembered best of all. Here you have about 55% of the schema incongruent events being remembered. This is a very typical pattern of results in these kinds of experiments, such that schema relevant events are remembered better than schema irrelevant events. And among the broad class of schema relevant events, schema incongruent events are remembered better than schema congruent events. So the first point of this study is that it matters, your memory for a fact depends on the relationship between that event and what you expect. The relationship between that event and what you believe or know about the world. And that leads us to our next memory principle, which is generally known as the schematic processing principle. And the way we can state this most succinctly is that memory is a function of the relationship between an event and pre-existing schemata. Or put in better English, I suppose, or at least more familiar English, memory is a function of the relationship between an event and pre-existing knowledge, expectations, and beliefs. This schemata, this cognitive schemata, organized set of knowledge, expectations, and beliefs, creates a background against which we process memories for specific events. And in fact, there are 2 different kinds of processes that seem to underlie this principle of schema dependency. There's one process that operates to give schema congruent behaviors an advantage in memory, and there's another process that operates to give schema incongruent behaviors an advantage in memory. And you see how this works? If we just kind of go through it. Schema congruent behaviors are very easily encoded in memory. They're what you expect to see. Knowing that Judy is intelligent and sophisticated and artistic, you expect to observe her doing intelligent and sophisticated and artistic kinds of things. So what happens then, if I then ask you to remember the events that happened to Judy, the things that Judy did, if you remember that she's intelligent and sophisticated and artistic, that information provides extra retrieval cues. It provides extra information that you can dig into memory and retrieve cue relevant information. So if I say, what were Judy's behaviors? Is, oh, who was Judy? Was Judy that one or was that one? I'd say, well, Judy was the intelligent, sophisticated, refined one. Say, oh, yeah, I remember that. There was the chess tournament, there was a symphony concert, and all of that business. So the advantage in memory provided by afforded to schema-congruent behaviors is in part a matter of organization, being able to relate pieces of information to each other and to things you already know, but also the schema provides extra retrieval cues. Your knowledge about Judy in general provides extra information that you can use to retrieve memory. Okay, so schema-congruent behaviors get an advantage in memory because the schema provides retrieval cues. What happens with schema-incongruent behaviors? Well, here, a second process comes into play, and that is that schema-incongruent behaviors, simply by virtue of the fact that they're not what you'd expect, they're not what you'd predict of Judy, they surprise you and they have to be explained. So if you already know that Judy is intelligent and sophisticated and artistic, you say, why can't she understand what's going on in Oprah, you know? Or why is it that she just kept making the same mistake 3 times? Well, what do you do when you observe somebody doing something that's surprising? You try to explain it. Well, maybe she's distracted. You know, she's got a friend who's in the Middle East right now, and she's just not paying too much attention. Or maybe, she was making lunch during Oprah and she just wasn't paying attention to that either. Whatever the explanation is, the interesting thing is that the explanation, generating an explanation, produces extra processing and ends up giving you a more elaborate representation in memory of the event than you would have had you not engaged in this explanatory activity. So in the same way, in much the same way that an unconditioned stimulus, surprises Pavlov's dog and leads Pavlov's dog to kind of search for predictors and try to control it and all that. An unexplained, unanticipated, surprising behavior leads us to try to figure out why that thing happened. That process of figuring out, generating hypotheses about why something happened, creates a more elaborate memory trace. So we know that retrieval cues make things more memorable. We know that elaboration makes things more memorable. The retrieval cues make schema-congruent behaviors more memorable. The elaborative processing makes schema-incongruent behaviors more memorable. Schema-irrelevant behaviors receive neither benefit. Because they're not consistent with the schema can't provide extra cue information that will lead you to retrieve a memory like she ordered a sandwich for lunch or she took an elevator to the 3rd floor. It's not going to help you for that. And again, because those events are irrelevant to what you know about Judy, they're not particularly surprising either. So you're not going to think about them too much. Ordered a sandwich for lunch. Big deal. Everybody orders a sandwich for lunch. Or whatever. So again, what you're seeing in the schematic processing principle is first that our pre-existing knowledge, beliefs, and expectations have an effect on what we're going to remember. We don't enter into any situation cold. We always carry into that situation some set of background knowledge, expectations, and beliefs, and try to relate what we're experiencing to those particular behaviors. So now we've got, we can say, kind of expand the schematic processing principle a little bit to say not just that memory is a function of the relationship between an event and pre-existing schemata, that's a start, but we can say that schema-relevant events are remembered better than schema-irrelevant events, and it turns out that schema-incongruent events tend to be remembered better than schema-congruent events. All right? So that's the schematic processing principle, and to some extent, that brings us to the end of the conventional story about memory. so that we can see the full set of principles that govern the encoding, the storage, and the retrieval of memory. Elaboration, organization, time dependency, cue dependency, encoding specificity, and schematic processing. Now, if you think about it for a second, a set of principles like this assumes a particular kind of framework for thinking about memory, and it's what some of us have come to call the library metaphor of memory. The library metaphor of memory basically says that memories are kind of like books. They're bought, they're cataloged, they're put on shelves, they're taken off shelves, they're read, they're put back on shelves. That the processing of books in a library creates a kind of analogy for the processing of memories in the mind. So we have some principles of memory encoding, like elaboration and organization, and there's an analogous set of processes that goes on in a library where a librarian will purchase a book for the collection and then catalog it. Then we have a set of principles that apply to the storage of memories, like time dependency, and there's an analogous process in the library where once the librarian puts a book on the shelf, it just kind of stays there for a while. And if you spend any time in libraries, you'll know that when you take a book off the shelf to use it, you're not supposed to put it back on the library shelf, and that's in part because there's a tendency for people to put books back wrong and they get lost, but also because if you put the book back on the red shelves in the library, then the librarians have a process whereby they can keep track of which books are being used and which ones aren't. But in any event, the book resides on the shelf for a while, in the same way that the memory remains available in memory storage, and then when you want to get out of memory, you do things like use retrieval queues and all that kind of business to try to get the memory out. In the same way, if you want to take a book out of the library, you don't just go to the library. You don't go to Moffat Library and say, oh, gee, I hope I find my book. Start going up and down the shelves, and all that kind of stuff, looking for the book. No, what you do is you look up the book in the catalog, you find its call number, you find out where those books with that call number are stored in the library, you go up there, you get the book from the shelf, you read the contents, and so on and so forth. So again, the library, in this view of memory, provides a kind of analogy for the processing of individual memories. But it turns out then that the base metaphor for this view of memory is one of memory as reproduction. That is to say, this library metaphor for memory assumes that remembering an event has some of the qualities of reproducing it, okay? If you take an exam, for example, you're thinking about reproducing what you read or what you heard in lecture from memory, so that encoding makes certain knowledge available and retrieval gains access to that knowledge. And so that we get these two basic mechanisms of forgetting. Either by virtue of poor encoding, the material is not available in memory, or by virtue of poor retrieval, available information is inaccessible in memory. Again, the idea is that in the same way that you reach onto a shelf to get a book, you reach back into memory to pick up some piece of knowledge. This view of memory will take you a long way, but it is not a complete view of memory, as was argued by the famous British psychologist Frederick Bartlett back in the 1930s, who had basic philosophical objections to the whole way by which people, like most psychologists, including myself, tend to study memory. He said, look, people are studying memory with lists of nonsense syllables and lists of isolated words and lists of isolated pictures, and memory just isn't like that, When you remember something, what you're really doing is telling a story to somebody else. You go home today and you tell your roommate about your day. You're not going to say psychology, chemistry 101, biology 1A, What you say is, oh, well, I went to psychology class and there was this lecture and it was all about, there was a story about these Indians, which I'm going to tell you in a second. And then I went to chemistry and the professor blew up this thing and it was really great. You tell the story, you know? And what Bartlett argued was that remembering is much more like telling a story than it is like reciting a grocery list, you know, 2 cans of applesauce, pork chop, or whatever it is. And so what Bartlett decided to do was to change how we studied memory, or at least how he studied memory, and try to get people to remember whole stories. And just to make things interesting, Bartlett used thematic material that was very unfamiliar to his subjects, like this famous story of the War of the Ghosts, which is a Native American folk tale. It's from northwestern America, Washington State. You know, to most ears, it's kind of a strange story because it's got certain aspects to it that are very unfamiliar. One night, 2 young men from Egulac went down to the river to hunt seals. Then they heard war cries, and they said, maybe this is a war party, and they hid. Some people came up in some canoes and said, come on, we're going to go down the river and we're going to fight some other Indians. And one guy said, no, I can't. I got family waiting for me at home, but you can go. So one of the young men went, and the other one returned home. And the warriors went down to this other town called Kalama, and there was a big battle. One of the Indians said, oh, we got to get out of here. That Indian's been hit. And then the young man realized that these were ghosts who were engaged in this battle. And they took him home, and he told his story, and then he died. That's the basic story of the War of the Ghosts. And the full story, which I don't have time to share with you here, is kind of, you know, it's kind of a strange story. He asked his Cambridge undergraduates to remember these stories. And when he did, what he discovered was that his subjects committed a variety of errors that people really hadn't experienced before. Of course, there was progressive forgetting. With time, people forgot a lot of details. They especially forgot minor details. They got the gist of the story, that it was a battle between 2 warring Indian villages, and there were some ghosts involved and all of that. But what's interesting is that whereas people like Ebbinghaus focused on forgetting, that is, the loss of detail in memory, what Bartlett discovered was that there's another process in remembering, and that has to do with the importation of details in memory. So in addition to these errors of commission, just progressive forgetting, he observed what he called errors of commission in his subjects. So, for example, they would rationalize stories, try to make it more rational, more reasonable. Instead of finding out towards the end of the story that the Indian band was a bunch of ghosts, the subjects would put it in the beginning, because once you see that, the story makes a lot more sense. They transform details. These students would, the story has the Indians coming down the river in canoes. They would say came down the river in boats, or came down the river in punts, or something like that. Transformation of order, again, to try to make the thing more sensible. And if you think about it for a second, that's what we do when we remember things. When we tell somebody about our memories, we don't necessarily tell them what happened exactly the way it happened. What we do is we make up a story that basically conveys the essence of an event to the subjects, but to the listeners, but which may not make a great, may not be completely faithful to what actually went on. This led Bartlett to argue that rather being a process of reproducing events in memory, remembering really was a process of reconstruction. That what happens when we remember an event is that we retrieve the dominant details from memory, but then we build up from that trace information a more or less coherent story that includes a kind of the general attitude, oh, this is a good story, this is a bad story, And then we import into the process of remembering a lot of inferences, filling in the gaps, filling in the details based on our general knowledge about the world, our beliefs about the world, and so on. The general idea here is you get the gist of an event out of memory, then you build up a more complete narrative representation of that event, a narrative representation that may be more coherent, but may not be particularly accurate. And that leads us to this final principle of memory, which is known as the reconstruction principle, which basically says that memory for an event reflects a blend of information retrieved from memory traces, okay, and information that's derived from our generalized knowledge, expectations, and beliefs. We're not reproducing events from memory when we remember. We are reconstructing events in memory. Now, Bartlett's view of memory as reconstructive in nature turned out to be a very powerful view, very persuasive, but Bartlett's own experiments, sad to say, were not particularly good. He was more of a theorist than he was an experimenter. But more recently, as people came to appreciate the arguments that Bartlett made, they begun to develop laboratory paradigms that allow us to observe these reconstructive processes in action. So, for example, Elizabeth Loftus, then at the University of Washington, now at University of California, Irvine, developed a laboratory procedure for studying eyewitness memories. If you're an eyewitness to a crime or you're an eyewitness to an automobile accident, the police will often ask you to tell them your version of what happened, and Loftus developed a laboratory procedure that was intended to capture the essential elements in this eyewitness memory situation. So, but as you'll see in a second, it's really just a variant on our standard verbal learning, the procedure in which instead of studying a list of words or a list of sentences, what subjects see is a more or less continuous scene played out in a series of slides. So what I want you to do for a second is just imagine that you're a bystander and you observe the following events take place. Could you turn the lights down for me, please? Thanks. I can't do it up here. Okay, that's what you see in this experiment. The kind of thing you could see, walking down the street, you see something like this happening. So after subjects get a chance to view this set of slides, then Loftus asks them some questions about it, like, did anyone pass the couple while they were walking down the driveway? Yes or no? Did another car pass the red Datsun while it was stopped at the stop sign? Yes or no? Was there another car in the street when the man entered the crosswalk? Yes or no? Was the man in the red shirt the driver of the Datsun? Yes or no? Okay, so having seen this series of slides that depict an event, and having been asked a set of questions about this event, then what Loftus did was to pose a memory test in the form of a recognition test in which she presented subjects with two scenes and asked them to indicate which one they actually saw. So, for example, they were asked which of these two scenes did they see, the top one or the bottom one. And they were asked which of these two scenes they saw, the top one or the bottom one. Okay, in fact, you saw this scene. And in the experiment, subjects actually saw this scene. That, for some reason, that was missing from the set that I just showed you. But here's the yield sign, okay? Now, here's what goes on in the experiment. This is what's known as the study generated evidence for what is now known as the post-event misinformation effect. Subjects watched a set of slides depicting a staged traffic accident, and then they were asked a set of critical questions, some of which were non-leading, like did you see another car pass the red Datsun while it was stopped at the yield sign? That's a non-leading, the subjects who were asked that question, that's a non-leading question because the car actually was stopped at a yield sign. Other subjects were asked a leading question, did you see another car pass the red Datsun while it was stopped at the stop sign? Okay, whereas in fact, what they saw was the car stopped at the yield sign. And then they were given a recognition test in which they were asked to choose between a picture of a car at a yield sign and a picture of a car at a stop sign. And the results of the experiment were really, so here's the design of the study. Some subjects saw the car at the yield sign. Some subjects saw the car at the stop sign. Some subjects were asked a question that assumed that there was a yield sign in the picture. For subjects who actually saw a yield sign, that question is non-leading, okay? But for subjects who saw a stop sign, that question is misleading because it implies that they actually saw a yield sign. Here again, for subjects who saw a yield sign, if the question implies that they saw a stop sign, that's a misleading question. But if the question implies that they saw a stop sign when in fact they did see a stop sign, that's correct information. Well, here's what goes on in the results of the study, which is if you look at the correct recognition of the scene, you get much more accurate memory for the subjects who got the correct wording of the question. That is, the question worded in a way that's congruent with what they actually saw, than those subjects who got the misleading version of the correction. Put another way, subjects who saw a stop sign but were asked a question that implied that there was a yield sign present failed to recognize the stop sign and instead falsely remembered seeing a yield sign. Subjects who saw a yield sign but who got a leading question that falsely implied that there was a stop sign failed to remember the yield sign but falsely remembered the stop sign instead. This is what's known as the post-event misinformation effect. And what it tells us is that leading questions that assume certain things to be true, that's what a leading question is, can influence people's eyewitness memory reports. And Loftus's conclusion from this, which is perfectly consistent with what Bartlett was arguing 40 years earlier, almost 50 years earlier, was that memory isn't pure. Memories aren't laid down once and forever at the time of encoding, okay? The trace that you encode is not a perfectly faithful representation of the event. Moreover, when you remember an event, you do much more than simply retrieve memory traces and then reproduce the event from them. Rather, misinformation that you get after the event can influence your memory for the event itself. Events that occurred in the retention interval during the so-called storage phase, or events that occur during the retrieval phase can actually affect your memory for the event itself. Okay, so again, the phenomenon of leading questions and eyewitness memory, the fact that leading questions can bias people to remember things that they didn't see, and to forget things that they did see is one of the reconstructive aspects of memory. When subjects are asked to say whether they saw a red stop sign, or a yield sign, one of the things they remember is not just what they saw in that instant, but also all the other things they know. Well, he just asked me a question. They asked me a question that assumed that there was a yield sign. So there must have been a yield sign, so I guess that's what I saw. I saw a yield sign instead of a stop sign. When we remember something, we take all the information that's available to us, not just the information that's encoded in a memory trace, but all the information that's available to us by virtue of our pre-existing knowledge, expectations, and beliefs, information that's available to us from experiences that we've had after the event, and we put it all together to reconstruct a representation of the event in memory. You can see this kind of reconstructive process in another memory paradigm. Imagine now, let's go back to a standard verbal learning experiment. Imagine for a moment that you're asked to study a list of words like this: thread, pin, eye, sewing, sharp, point, prick, thimble, haystack, thorn, hurt, injection, syringe, cloth, and knitting, okay? Now, as it turns out, each one of these 15 words is a close semantic associate of the word needle. If I say, give me the first word that comes to mind when I say needle, you are very likely to say thread, pin, eye, sewing, sharp, point, haystack, and so on. Now, as it turns out, however, needle is not in the study list. Just the free associates are in the study list. However, if subjects study a list of associates of words like needle, and then we test them give them a test of recognition memory in which we have 3 different kinds of items, something interesting happens. Some of the items are what we call old items. They're words that the subjects actually studied on the list, words like thread. Other items are critical lures that are associatively related to the old items, but weren't actually in the study list, words like needle. And then on the recognition test also contains a number of unrelated lures, that is, words that just have no relationship to the items that the subjects studied. So you give subjects a recognition test of memory that consists of old items, critical lures, that items that were not actually presented but are associatively related to items that were, and unrelated items, and you test memory and you get something like this. This is proportion recognized. People recognize the studied items pretty well. They're recognizing about 85, 88% of the items on the list. That's very good memory performance. Notice, however, that they are falsely recognizing critical lures at pretty much the same rate. They're saying thread was on the list, and they're right about that. Thread was on the list, but they're also saying that needle was on the list, and they're wrong about that. Needle was not on the list. If you ask them about a word like sleep, they'll say, nah, that was not on the list, and they're almost always right about that. So what's happening in this kind of study is that if you study a list of words like thread and pin and sewing and thimble and haystack and syringe, what happens is that you begin to think about other associatively related words like needle. And by virtue of thinking about these related words, you become confused in memory and you begin to think that you actually studied those associatively related words as well. Okay? This is a phenomenon that is known as the associative memory illusion. If we have a set of experiences, we tend to remember not just the experiences that we've had, but we tend to falsely remember things that are associatively or semantically related to those experiences as well. Okay? Having studied a list of words like thread and pin, we falsely remember associatively related information like needle. And again, this is quite consistent with Bartlett's view of memory as reconstructive. When I ask you to remember this list, you start saying, oh yeah, there were a whole bunch of words on that list that had to do with needles and sharp things and stuff like that. And that leads you to falsely remember the word needle when it wasn't actually presented. You're building up, you're reconstructing, you're telling a story about what happened to you. You're not simply reproducing what you experienced. You're not just retrieving memory traces, you're making inferences. You're solving a problem, trying to figure out what it was that happened to you. And that allows us to say that there are illusions in memory, much the same way that there are illusions in perception. In the same way that we see the moon on the horizon as bigger than the moon at zenith, when in fact it is not, okay? Or we see the feathered line as longer than the arrowed line in the Müller-Lyer illusion, we also remember things that happened when in fact they did not. We see things that aren't there, we remember things that didn't happen. So in the perceptual illusions, what we're doing is we're perceiving the present inaccurately. We're perceiving lines as longer than they are, we're perceiving disks as bigger than they are, and so on. And we learned in the last set of lectures that these perceptual illusions are a product of constructive activity on the part of the perceiver. The fact that in perceiving, the perceiver goes beyond the information given in the stimulus and brings to the act of perception a set of knowledge, inferences, beliefs, problem solving, hypothesis testing, and so on. In the same way, in the illusions of memory, we're not perceiving the present inaccurately, but we're remembering the past inaccurately. And it's not just that we're forgetting details, there are systematic distortions, systematic biases in memory that are produced by the fact that remembering is not just a matter of reproducing the past, remembering is also a matter of reconstructing the past. In the same way that the perceiver goes beyond the information given in the stimulus to construct a mental representation of the world, the rememberer goes beyond the information given in the memory trace to reconstruct a representation of the past. So again, want to explore some of the implications of this principle of reconstruction, and that is to say, in the final analysis, for all the purchase that the library metaphor gives us in trying to understand the processes of memory, it's not quite right to think about memory traces as records of past experiences. Memories turn out not to be simply records of the past. Rather, in a very real sense, our memories are our beliefs about the past. They're the stories we tell ourselves, the stories we tell other people about the past, but they're not necessarily completely accurate representations of history. Okay? So now we've got the full set of principles, 7 principles of memory: elaboration, organization, time dependency, cue dependency, encoding specificity, schematic processing, and this last one that is a principle of reconstruction that is parallel to the principle of perceptual construction that we talked about earlier. And that then leads us to offer you a unified view of perception and memory. We talked at the beginning about the relationship between what we perceive and what we remember, that the act of perception draws on memory, and that the act of perception leaves a trace of itself in memory. Those are two aspects of the relationship between perception and memory. But at a very deep level, we want you to see that perceiving and remembering involve very similar kinds of procedures. In both cases, both for perceiving and for remembering, the person is engaged in what Bartlett called effort after meaning. The perceiver is trying to make sense of the stimulus. The rememberer is trying to make sense of the information contained in the memory trace. Both perception and memory involve problem-solving activity. The perceiver is trying to solve the problem of figuring out what's going on here now. The rememberer is trying to solve the problem of what went on there and then. Perception, as we say, involves constructive activity in which the perceiver takes all the information that's available, information in the stimulus, information stored in memory, and builds up a representation of what's going on. Something very similar happens in memory, where memory is reconstructive activity. The rememberer takes information from the trace, information from other sources, knowledge, expectations, and beliefs, and then builds up, reconstructs, not reproduces, but reconstructs a mental representation of the past. Perceiving is constructive activity. Remembering, in the final analysis, is reconstructive activity. Both of them involve reasoning, judgment, decision-making, problem-solving, hypothesis testing, and that's what we'll talk about next week. Thank you very much.